Hello, Jaya and Professor Mridula Mukherjee.
Hello, Mahalakshmi.
Hello. Hi. We're just waiting for others. I thought it was, coming on fairly easily, but we seem to have some of the speakers who haven't yet logged in. So we're just waiting.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's sure. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Hello, Professor Ghosh. Suchandra Di, hello.
Yeah, hello, Mahalakshmi. It sounds very strange when you address me as Professor Ghosh, so I just took a fraction of a second.
Hi, Maha, I'm here.
Hi.
Hello, Suchandra.
Hello, ma'am.
I won't call you Professor Ghosh.
No, absolutely not. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Sir, Professor Habib. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir. This is Suchandra here.
Irfan Sahib is muted as of now.
Yes.
Hello, Rajan.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Very nice that you could join.
Hello, Rajan.
Hello.
Suchandra here.
Yeah.
Good evening, Mrs. Jha. Hello, Vishwamohan.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Mrs. Jha and Jasmine और प्राची आ गए हैं?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon.
Okay, hi. I only know you through your WhatsApp messages and emails. So I'm sorry I didn't recognize you over there. Hello. Mr. Vishwamanja, hello.
Hello, Mahal. You can hear me?
Yes, absolutely fine. Professor Bagchi is also here, has also joined, and Shireen ma'am has also joined.
Hello, Amyuda. Good to see you. Mridula here. Hi.
I'll wait for another 1 minute for Professor Prabhat Patnaik. Has he joined? And Professor Basant, hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Yeah.
We'll just wait for Professor Prabhat Patnaik also to join in.
Yes.
Hello.
हाँ, hello, Rajan. किसको? प्रभात को?
हाँ, भेजा है गूगल मीट.
हाँ, प्रभात को गूगल मीट भेजा है.
महालक्ष्मी को वो भेजा हुआ है ईमेल.
हाँ, क्योंकि उनको ईमेल किया है. इनफैक्ट वी आर वेटिंग फॉर हिम टू जॉइन.
I'll just ask Maha.
I don't have his number, So can you please forward the message I sent you on WhatsApp just now so that he can?
No. But you have sent him by email, isn't it? Earlier.
I sent him the email on the email address you had given me.
Yes.
What I
नहीं उनको ईमेल देख लें अभी वहां से पूछा है
अभी दोबारा कर देते हैं. Just resend it to him by email.
ठीक है
And WhatsApp. You can just do it from my phone.
रीसेंड कर देते हैं
And this is the last one. I just got an email from her, which you can forward to Prabhat. And today, Professor Musri has turned on her camera. But you are mute.
Yes. No, I have to keep myself mute or have this because my parrots from below and the railway and the train from the side, which most of you know, will disturb everybody other.
Yes,
That's true.
parrot more than the train.
You come with your household and the neighborhood. एक बारी फोन करके अगर अलर्ट करते हैं.
Just call it over.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, Professor Patnaik. Evening, rather. Professor Patnaik?
It should be visible, but I can see them, but I can't.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Now we can see you. We could hear you earlier. Now we can see you as well.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Kanishka?
We kept the numbers small on this Google Meet link. And so we are actually live streaming this memorial meeting. And in just a second, I will begin on the formal proceedings. So I'll request everybody to please turn off your mics And if you will, please keep your videos on. Professor Dwijendra Narayan Jha, a historian of great repute, a public intellectual who commanded the respect of all those who value scientific research, a scholar who believed in a secular and democratic ethos, a fine human being, left us on 4th February 2021. His going came as a shock to many of us who had spoken to him or received email and WhatsApp messages from him barely a few days before his demise. The outpouring of messages from those who knew him well through their association with him as colleagues, students, and friends, as well as through association with his ideas presented in numerous publications, is a testimony to the respect he commanded. On behalf of the Delhi Historians Group, who in association with the Aligarh Historians Society, Sehmat, and social scientists have organized this memorial meeting, I thank you all for being here with us today. We have lost a valued colleague, comrade, teacher, and friend. His contribution to the study of ancient Indian history in particular, but to Indian history in general, may be known to many of us here. His contribution to public discourse by prompting and provoking us to reason and debate issues rather than to accept political dogma and popular sentiment in place of historical interpretation would be known to all of you. We are gathered today not only to mourn the great loss of Professor DN Jha, but to also celebrate his life and contributions as a historian and as a public intellectual. There are several scholars here who will be offering their tribute and will be talking about various aspects related to his scholarship and to his endeavors as a public intellectual. But I think we should also remember Professor DN Jha for his tongue-in-cheek humor that is revealed in several of his writings and his ability to raise the most significant issues in such a simple and lucid way. I had the opportunity to review several of his works in recent years, and in this collection of essays that he edited, which included 3 of his own papers. It also included papers by H.D. Sankalia, by Suvira Jaiswal, by K.M. Shrimali, and others. The title of this work was Contesting Symbols and Stereotypes, Essays in Indian History and Culture, published by Akar Books in 2013. It seemed to me that the untrained eye, and we seem to have too many untrained eyes who take a pot shot at history, the untrained eye would see in this volume all that is Hindu-hating and denigrating to Indian culture. But it is precisely to delegitimize the fiction for you. Such was the spirit of DN Jha. We now present a short video created by research scholars at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, Sneha Ganguly and Prerna Roy, that highlights some memorable moments in DN Jha's remarkable life and career. May I request that the video be shown now, please?
unmuted yourself.
We now have a video recording of Professor Romila Thapar, where she pays her tribute to Professor DN Jha.
It is really sad occasion that one has gathered here to speak. Professor DN Jha is passing away. He is a tremendous loss, both to scholarship and to ancient Indian history. The more so because in recent years he was redoubling his efforts to question history, the kind of history that was written according to the Hindutva model. And to underline even more strongly the importance of a rational explanation and narration of the past. Jha was trained in Residency College in the days when it was its heyday with students and faculty focusing on
Jha's early study of revenue systems was a part of his interest in economic history. It also drew him later towards what became an extensive debate. Jha's early study of the question of whether there was or was not what might be called revenue systems was a part of his interest in economic history. In defense of feudalism in India, he edited two books on the subject. It also drew him later towards, at the time, and when this was a much debated study, the question was whether there was or wasn't, and drew the attention of historians in other parts of the world. What might be out of this discussion was that sources that had been studied primarily for political history, such as the multiplicity of inscriptions, he edited two books on the subject. Now began later was and remained and supported the idea much of a basic economic change. The history of this period, therefore, began to be viewed quite differently from the way it had been in the past. When Jha's writings drew the attention of historians in other parts. This also meant a major questioning by colonial disputations and some aspects of the primarily interpretation of economic history, such as where nationalist history accepted the colonial books on the and later was introduced to and supported the idea there it was questioned. Jha was critical of this interpretation. Colonial historians had invented the two-nation theory to explain Indian history. This had resulted in the periodization of Indian history, which they made into a Hindu period and a Muslim period. A periodization that is still sometimes referred to in popular writing and in Hindutva history, although it has been discarded by academic historians. Rooted in the colonial interpretations from which they drew these ideas were the two religious nationalisms, the Hindu and the Islamic. Both were opposed to the major anti-colonial secular nationalism. The ideology of Hindutva incorporates Hindu nationalism and the majoritarianism inevitably that goes with it. It encourages the writing of a history of India where the arguments are based on the communal reading of history, foundational to its ideology. Jha was strongly opposed to this. He articulated this opposition through his choice of historical subjects, which he carefully investigated. His work was intended to negate this kind of communal history. For example, there is his much admired book on the Holy Cow. History, according to Hindutva, maintains that the cow was central to Hindu belief and practice. The Holy Cow has been and remains the hardy perennial of Hindutva, as in the theory that its flesh has been forbidden as food in the past. Jha combed the ancient texts and showed that a number of them, including medicinal texts, mention the consumption of beef. Beef eating today has become a kind of political slogan, and hence its prominence in the Hindutva version of history. As with some of us as well, and our numbers seem to be increasing, Jha was also publicly abused, reviled, and received death threats for writing the history that he wrote. All this is somewhat surprising, coming as it does from a society. I think it was E.H. Carr, if I mistake not, who said that the best historians are the ones who research the past, but at the same time are fully aware of the present. I think that's an excellent description of a good historian. And Professor DN Jha was one of these whose passing can only be deeply regretted.
What became an extensive debate on the question
We thank Professor Thapar. She could not be here today, and that is why she asked us to record this message at her home. I would now like to request Professor Irfan Habib to say a few words.
Professor Mahalakshmi and colleagues, after Professor Mahalakshmi had spoken on Professor DN Jha's life and work, and Professor Romila Thapar has outlined the major features of his outlook and the situation in which he worked and now we live. There's very little for me to really add, except perhaps a few reminiscences which illustrated for me both the boldness of DN's thought. I'm sorry, we used to refer to Professor Jha as DN usually, and that continues with me. And also his enormous learning, which was never carried on his sleeves, but one knew that when he said anything about ancient India or about anything in the past, or for that matter in the present, this had the most reliable basis. As a historian of medieval times, I'm very grateful for DN's researches on the earlier phase of the medieval period, which is usually regarded as about 700 to 1200. Although he insisted on using the word feudalism for this period, with the addition of the word Indian to illustrate that all the features of European feudalism were not present. What is important in his researches for a student of the later time is the picture he drew of India before 1200. He basically argued that following Professor Sharma, but in many ways concentrating matters, Professor Sharma did not say as much on land ownership, for example, as DN did, that the concept of land ownership was the essential feature of feudal India that had been created, he thought, through land grants. The admittedly larger information that we have from 13th century onwards cannot really be. And therefore, Professor Jha's work was not only important for historians of ancient India, but also very important for the position, the Marxist approach to Indian history. And I remember that in one preface he criticized those who suddenly abandoned the Marxist approach for postmodernism just because communist regimes in Eastern Europe had fallen.
Professor Amiyobakchi, sir?
He has to unmute himself. It's muted.
Hear me now?
Yes, sir, but your video also needs to be turned on. Huh. Yes, now you're all right.
Professor Mahalakshmi Ramakrishnan and friends and colleagues. I am not an expert on ancient Indian history. I met DN Jha, who was several years junior to me, about 2 years, in company with his close friends in the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. In particular, the late Professor Shogata Mukherjee, and our registrar Sushanta Ghosh. He always had a smile on his face, and he was always interesting to talk to. The only book of his which I have read reasonably well is one of the iconic books, The Myth of the Holy Cow. I had known from reading the Mahabharata and other texts that the so-called Aryans, that is the speakers of the Indo-Aryan group of languages who migrated to India from Central Asia, were great meat eaters. Their yajnas were actually occasions for sacrificing animals that they could eat. And they included the cow. And I also knew from the story of Duryodhana's sending the Durvasa Muni to ruin the Pandavas, that he had fed the irate Rishi with veal in order to please him. And a guest was called a Governor. But what I learned from DN's book was that even during the time when Manusmriti was written, which has become the Bible of Hindutva, the cow was not a forbidden animal for eating. This is all that we know about his work, but I had also read his very courageous articles as a public intellectual in several journals, including Scrolling, where he was always ready to take on the people who are distorting the diversity of Indian history and were trying to make it into a completely mythical history of only Hindus who were here, Hindus who never migrated from abroad, Hindus who, in fact, who did not use the word Hindu at all for themselves, but Sanatana Dharma. That Hindu is a word, in fact, which was used by the Arabs. And if the Hindutvawalas were aware of that, they would have to try to find out what other words they could use. I'm very sorry that somebody as great a historian and as courageous a man as DN Jha, more formally Professor Dwijendra Narayan Jha of Delhi University, a great teacher, a great scholar, and a great public intellectual, has passed away. I will miss him both as a public intellectual and as a friend whom I had the privilege of meeting from time to time.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Professor Prabhat Patnaik to say a few words. Sir, could you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you very much, Mahalakshmi, friends and colleagues. Whenever one thinks of Professor DN Jha, the term that immediately comes to one's mind is courage. He was an outstandingly courageous person, both in his history writing, of which the Holy Cow is an example, and as a public intellectual. His commitment to secularism and democracy was as strong and powerful as his ability to take on all those who were now engaged in subverting it. As a matter of fact, I used to meet him quite often in the Sahmat office, where he would be sitting quietly and inconspicuously. Sahmat office, as you know, is one of those places where there's complete equality and fraternity. so that in a little corner there would be Professor Jha with a stick, and we would talk about various things. And that's how I met him. And there was not a single occasion in which there was a secular cause to be defended where Professor Jha would not be called upon to help and would invariably help. He was, of course, very kind enough to include one of my articles in a book he edited called The Many Careers of D.D. Kosambi. Why he included my article, I don't know, but I remain very grateful to him. But nonetheless, my knowledge of his historical work naturally is rather limited. But I had great regard for him because he was fond of debate. As a historian, he was always fond of debate. Now, I think debate plays a very important role in the development of any discipline. As a matter of fact, a discipline comes into its own when it sheds its kind of prehistory. It's pre-science. When it moves from mythology, from superstition, from all kinds of things of that sort to reasoning based on evidence. I mean, there's a kind of thing, for instance, you have in medicine when you move from bloodletting to a more scientific basis for medicine. Now, similarly, in the study of Indian history, Professor Jha was associated with a group of other historians. Me, as an outsider, always had this impression where they were really associated with the transition of history in India, or history study in India, from a pre-scientific to a scientific discourse. Now, the moment you think of a scientific discourse, obviously, any evidence is subject to all kinds of alternative interpretations. Therefore, being open to debate, being open to other interpretations is as much a part of the movement from pre-science to science as the movement itself. And in that sense, Professor Jha was a person whom I have always respected greatly because of his openness to debate, and that openness to debate was really symptomatic of an extremely scientific outlook and scientific mind to the study of Indian history. He was absolutely, for that reason, to me, a front-ranking historian of the country. Therefore, his passing is a remarkable loss, not only to the discipline, but also to the struggle for democracy and secularism in the country.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. May I now request Professor Shireen Musfi to say a few words. Ma'am, you have to unmute yourself, please.
My tribute to Professor Jha will be more in the form of some reminiscences. I first met, rather saw DN in 1970 at the Jabalpur session of the Indian History Congress. I still remember he was standing near Professor R.S. Sharma when Professor Nurul Hassan has introduced me to him. Sharmaji as a recently appointed statistician for working in quantitative history. His DN Jha's quizzical looks made me remember him forever. In 1975, at the session of the Indian History Congress held at Aligarh, I really met him. As a volunteer on the registration desk, helping him in securing his preferred accommodation, besides handing him over a badge and bag, I also tried to show him the place where he has to go. And that was the beginning of a sort of friendship, or the way I started getting his affection, which continued till the end. I always met him in most of the Indian History Congress sessions, and I still remember his address as a sectional president to the ancient Indian history delivered in 1979. In this address, he contested the Asiatic mode of production, the application of Asiatic mode of production to India, and contested also that there was no unchangeableness in Asian society, and that Oriental despotism was following D.B. Kosambi and R.S. Sharma. He extended the evidence to the 13th century on the basis of the Hoysala and other inscriptions, that there was always resistance by the peasant. They were fighting for their own cause, and these were serious challenges to, and it was not certainly in any type of a society where no resistance was offered, and as was conceived in Asiatic mode of production. At Shantiniketan in 2005 and 6, where he was the Journal President of the Indian History Congress, he read a presidential address which he titled "Looking for Hindu Identity." He argued for seeing Hinduism as a multifactorial historical and cultural process, and not a decontextualized phenomena not linked to material relationship on the ground. He went in great details to support his thesis, to confirm whatever he was saying, and he ended with a line which I always remember. He said that historians cannot be the custodian of religion. Our task is to critically explain it. Of course, whatever he had said has a great relevance for today as well, and therefore he is going away at this critical juncture of our country's history, where these ideas are challenged by all means, is all the more serious a loss to the entire country, I believe, not only to the community of historians. And it is such a loss that perhaps we will be feeling.
Thank you so much, ma'am. May I now request Professor Mridula Mukherjee to say a few words.
Thank you, Mahalakshmi. I'm very grateful to Professor Mahalakshmi for having put in all the effort to organize this memorial meeting, especially in a manner that all of us from all over the country have been able to come together. I'm particularly grateful to her for having taken the trouble of reaching out to people in various colleges, universities, former colleagues, students of Professor Jha, and making it possible for all of us to get together and express our views in a situation where, as you know, physical meetings are not possible. I am thankful also to her for this opportunity that I have been given to express my feelings on this occasion. Well, as many of you, I knew Professor Jha as a colleague, somebody one would meet, look forward to meeting at the annual sessions of the History Congress. And of course, since he had moved to the Delhi University many years ago, there were many occasions of running into him, including at the Sehmat office, as Prabhat was reminding us. But on many occasions, selection committee meetings, seminars, workshops. And I also had the pleasure of sometimes being meeting him outside Delhi, where we had gone together to attend some selection committee meetings and could spend the evening together. He was a wonderful raconteur of stories, laced always with his very biting humor, and he loved the good things of life, so we could spend the evening in a very, very enjoyable way. So I have lovely memories of spending very good time with him on a number of occasions. He was a very warm human being. One never met him when he was in a dull mood or wouldn't really come across and greet you in a very, very warm and vigorous way. So his personality was a very positive one, though at times he would have this laconic kind of outward appearance where it seemed like he was not forthcoming, but you only had to get him going, ask him a few favorite issues for him to then get into his mood. And I would like to say that as Professor Patnaik pointed out, courage is the first word that comes to mind when you think of Professor Jha. But along with that, immediately, as Professor Irfan Habib said right in the beginning, is this enormous scholarship. In fact, it is this, in a sense, unusual, but I think we historians have been very lucky on this very screen that is in front of me. I see so many of them who have this this combination of courage and scholarship. And I think Professor Jha also was a perfect example of that. And this is what has given Indian historians the capacity to fight back and the kind of onslaught that we are facing today, and to stand up for the values of the freedom struggle, for the values of our people's struggles, for the values of our ancient traditions as well, about which Professor Jha enlightened us in so many ways. So I think we have been very lucky as a fraternity. It's not for nothing that the quality of history writing in this country is considered to be as good as anywhere in the world. It is precisely to people of the kind of scholars of Professor Jha, who learned under the great teachers like Professor R.S. Sharma, and that whole generation of exceptional scholars that we had, Professor Thapar, Professor Irfan Habib, Professor Bipin Chandra, that we were very lucky, I think, to follow on in the footsteps of these people and to take their ideas and their principles and their values forward. I think this is what has given the strength to our whole fraternity to be able to come together and put up the kind of resistance that I think it admirably has. And especially I would like to mention that he was a great participant, supporter, I would say a permanent feature of the Indian History Congress. One cannot remember him without remembering his affection and love for that organization, and how much he valued it and how much he contributed to it as well, as secretary, as holding very important positions, always attending. So I would like to also recall his faith in that institution, and also recall how that institution has enabled all of us under the leadership particularly of Professor Irfan Habib, to be able to play the kind of role that Indian historians have been able to play in the public life of this country at this very crucial juncture where our role has somehow become much more important than normally historians would be expected to play. I would also like to say that, I always wondered at this, during this very long period when he was fighting the battle over his book, The Myth of the Holy Cow, legal battles, not getting published, being suppressed, etc. It took many years. And whenever one met him, naturally one would ask, so Jha Sahab, क्या हो रहा है इसके बारे में, आपकी किताब कहाँ पहुंची है. And he would always have a little funny story to tell you about the latest, kind of attack that he was facing. I never saw him dismayed, phased, or saying, oh God, I'm really tired about this long battle. It's been going on so long. Anybody can get tired when it takes years for you to go on a particular issue. But he had that enormous composure and that determination. And as I said, courage, of course, but in a way which we always carried it so lightly. Always as if, yes, it was part of the game and that was what life was all about. And one did what one had to do. I also wanted to mention that he was very keen that we revive the Delhi Historians Group, which had been set up many years ago under the leadership of Professor Bipin Chandra, but then for various reasons, we had not been very active. And in fact, as we had been trying for the last few months to revive the group, and I was very keen to call up Professor Jha and tell him, because every time he met me, he would say, when are you people doing that? We really need it to get going again. And I wanted very much to tell him that we are actually doing what he wanted us to do. And in a way, it is, I'm very happy that perhaps our first public event after our revival has been this memorial meeting that we have been able to organize along with other friends on this occasion. In recent years, particularly, I think it's important to point out, as some others have also done tangentially, but I want to just forefront it. I think he was very concerned about this particular strand of Hindutva thought, which he, I think, believed was very dangerous, which is the valorization of the Hindu tradition, the Hindu past, the Indian past being reduced to the Hindu past, Indian history being reduced to, especially in the ancient period, to Hindu history, and then a valorization of that, a glorification of that, by saying that it was intrinsically tolerant, non-violent, all that could be pristine and pure. And I think he somehow saw the grave dangers of this kind of a notion, because it would lead to a certain kind of arrogance. It would lead to a strengthening of the Hindutva mindset. It would make it easier for the Hindutva ideology to be sold to ordinary people. If you could paint them as always being the ones who were tolerant, who were non-violent, and the other communities, all the violence that we see in our society, all the negative things that we see in our society are all that has been brought in by Islam, by Muslim communities, by invaders, by foreigners, etc. And therefore, what we saw particularly in the last few years was how he was always trying to bring a lot of evidence to back the notion that Hindus were just like everybody else. They were nothing exceptional. There were strands of tolerance, of non-violence in them. In fact, they were much more in the Jain and the Buddhist traditions rather than in the strictly Hindu or Sanatan Dharam tradition. And that there were also there were conflicts, there were violent conflicts, there was rancor, the sects fought each other. It was not like a happy family, always living out some kind of idealized kind of a life. And I think that is very important. And that just showed how, I think what Romila, the remarks she made about the value of the historian. The good historian is one who has his roots deep into the past, but is very conscious of the present. And I think that link between the kind of work he did with the concerns of the present. Cannot imagine Professor Jha without that kind of connection. I think I would like to stop here, but just a word to offer very personal condolences to Mrs. Jha. We always saw them together. She was a very valued companion for DN. We all knew that. And I want to take this opportunity to be able to say that we are with you in this hour of grief and we understand how you feel. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. May I now request Professor Rajan Gurukul to say a few words.
Thank you, Professor Mahalakshmi. Respected Professor Irfan Habib, Professor Amiya Kumar Bakchi, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, and my dear colleagues. I need hardly say that Jitendra Narayan Jha's demise is a great loss. Already, historians have expressed his contributions, referred to his contributions, and I don't have to repeat the well-known contributions made by Professor Jha. He was not only a famous historian on early India, but also a politically engaging activist, bold and untiring. DN was a public intellectual reflecting the dynamics of the social relevance of history by remaining a professional in the field, noted for his sustained engagement with critical socio-cultural history, fighting the obscurantist version of the past. DN addressed the educated public in an accessible way with undeniable empirical evidence, methodological preoccupation, and theoretical explanation in countering questions of ideological distortion of the past. DN always defended the intellectual depth of history as a field of knowledge. He demonstrated not only his students, but also the general public, the methodology of history as the science of searching out clues for the meanings of past, the art of self-consciously shaping historical questions, theoretical making sense of the data, the craft of ascertaining the evidence, the logical probing into anomalies, and the basis of writing the explanatory narrative contributing to reliable knowledge about the past that reinforces the concerns of the present. A critical thinker, not exempt from the forces of history and compulsions of the present, shaping his own thoughts and actions, sharing with his students the excitement of meaningful historical research and the social responsibility of fighting the communal misrepresentation of the past. Jha had demonstrated himself as an activist historian teacher. His lectures and writings addressed early India, his specialized field of academic identity as part of the greater whole, the past, present, and future. Pursuing the path of T.D. Kosambi and expanding R.S. Sharma's findings, his historical studies revolved around early Indian society, economy, polity, ideology, and so on. All his books and edited works are related to the issues and paradigms thereof. A committed professional, he was an integral part of the Indian History Congress and had always stood for its progressive cause and policy debates. We remember him as one of its frontline fighters against misappropriation and communalization of history. Critical, ethical, and empathetic, DN used his historical scholarship to counter and subdue Sanghi historians. We all know about the threat he had to face. Already historians mentioned about it. For the work, The Myth of the Holy Cow, and the two subsequent publications, Rethinking Hindu Identity, Drink of Immortality, and then various articles. In these works, he figures as an organic intellectual, assuming Gramscian war of position. He confronted and exposed the obfuscating notions of the Hindutva writers and their unsustainable claims. DN was firmly footed in the path of intellectual and social struggles against the communal propagandists and their arguments. Out and out, an unassuming scholar, above board and friendly to all, DN has created a big gap through his natural exit. I am personally indebted to him for allowing me to take the benefits of discussions on various occasions with him on my topics of research. His temple as the landed magnet influenced my study of the Kerala temple very much. I have to say, we really, really miss him.
Thank you, Professor Gurukul. May I now request Professor Vishwamohan Jha to say a few words.
All right. Am I audible now?
Yes, you are.
Thank you, Professor Mahalakshmi. I was in the midst of a presentation by first-year undergraduates of St. Stephen's College when I came to know at about 7 p.m. of the passing away of Professor DN Jha. Some 3-4 hours later, late in the evening, I was still in a state of shock when Sukriti Barua of the Indian Express called. What was my first reaction? She asked. Unthinkingly, I said, Professor Jha made ancient history contemporary. That is probably how our subconscious, the unconscious of psychoanalysts works. Today, when I try to recall my past history of association with him, I go back to the year 1979, when I took admission in BA History Honours course in Patna College, and I began learning ancient Indian history with Professor R.N. Nandi. Nandiji's favorite sentence of starting or ending the discussion of any significant historical issue would be that quote from Benedetto Croce about all history being contemporary. We did not need Nandiji's advice as such for buying our copy of DN Jha's Ancient India, which was among the first things, which was among the very first pieces of advice that our seniors would give. But it was Nandiji's and Professor Vijay Kumar Thakur's lectures. It was Nandiji's slight tweaking of Croce. His plea was not that all history is, as a matter of fact, contemporary history, but that all good history ought to be contemporary. It was these things, their lectures, the tweaking, that created the milieu in which I had my first introduction of Professor Dvijendra Narayan Jha. These people made the new versions of, these people made the new versions of this new history, as Professor Romila Thapar has called it, this new history. They made it fashionable in Patna in late 1970s, early 80s. It was my friend doing economics who would first tell me about Romila Thapar's History of India before I took admission. Another from Political Science Department who actually gifted me a copy of her Patel lectures, The Past and Prejudice. Without Professor DN Jha, this fashion would have lost much of its glitter, its shine and simmer. And then, while still doing my BA, by a stroke of sheer luck, this is what I would like to show. I get my first copy, a copy of this book which had just been published. In 1980, early in 1980, he published studies in early Indian economic history. So it was a stroke of luck at the time because, by that time, the institutional slide at Patna University had set in. Normally, months, even years would pass by before a book would find its way in our college or university library. and then will remain beyond the reach of junior students. I began to read this book, and I cannot fully convey the manner in which it has left an impression on me. I mean, I can still recall vividly the deep impression that its first essay on economic historiography, with its easy style and breathtaking range of discussions, created on my young, impressionable mind. The basic reason of my choice of a specialization in ancient Indian history for my master's was my budding atheism. That was the basis. But it was my training at Patna College that equipped me with the intellectual resources founded on my readings in history that would enable me to debate things with my believer family and friends. It was this training which gave a definite fillip to it. In fact, it almost decided the issue that I would be doing ancient Indian history and nothing else. Professor DN Jha's works occupy in this manner a very significant place in the foundations of my outlook, including my choice of career. There are so many things which we have been saying, many common things which can be said. I mean, there would be no end to it. Time is short, and at any rate, I have had occasion to write in some detail about Professor Jha previously, including a recent write-up. So today, I mean, given the restless energies of his intellectual labors, for instance, I mean, his passing away, sudden passing away, when he stayed in the pink of his intellectual health. His physical health was failing, but his wit, his intellectual alertness, nothing had suffered any visible impairment. I mean, the range of issues which he went on tackling, given the restless energies of his intellectual labors, there was actually no telling in which direction his iconoclasm would turn next. He remained full of life, as Professor Midla Mukherjee has so vividly described. I mean, without being privy to it, I am even given to believe that he retained to the end even that naughty sense and naughty ear for juicy gossip. In the end, I mean, I remember this voracious reader of books also as a highly excitable bibliophile. DN Jha has heard of a book, he must have it anyhow. If Mr. Mehra of Selection Books cannot procure it, some MPhil student might. And in the end, there was always his Princeton connection. This priceless collection, his priceless collection of books, must serve as the best memento of this savant. And if his progressive leftism is to have any say in the matter, this collection must not go to any of the well-supplied, well-funded libraries of Delhi, a place in which it would be really needed and win heartfelt appreciation daily basis. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vishwamohan Jha. I've had a number of people who have known Professor DN Jha. We now have a small video recording of someone in Patna University who could not join us today, but who has recorded his memories and would like to offer his tribute to Professor DN Jha. I request that the video be played. This is Dr. Close Associate who was in Patna and who also came to Delhi with at almost the same time as Professor Jha.
प्रोफेसर DN झा से मेरा ताल्लुका था 15 वर्ष से, तो हम एक दूसरे के नेबर भी थे। समाप्त हो गया। मैं BA फर्स्ट ईयर का विद्यार्थी था, पटना कॉलेज में दाखिला हुआ था। BA ऑनर्स में वो एंशिएंट इंडिया और MA में इजिप्ट और मेसोपोटामिया का इतिहास पढ़ाते थे। उनका लेक्चर एक्सटेम्पोर होता था हम लोग सुनते थे और पॉइंट नोट कर लिया करते थे। नई नई बात सीखने का मौका मिलता था। प्राचीन भारत के विषय में एक नए दृष्टिकोण की जानकारी मिलती थी। ग्लोरिफिकेशन ऑफ द पास्ट का खंडन मिलता था। मार्क्स इस दृष्टिकोण से, लेकिन तथ्यों के आधार पर भारतीय धर्मों का इतिहास, जातियों की उत्पत्ति, रिपब्लिक इन एंशिएंट इंडिया, जैनिज्म, बुद्धिज्म और ब्राह्मणिज्म में जो कॉन्फ्लिक्ट था उसका प्रवचन होता था। कास्ट कैसे बना, देवी देवताओं की उत्पत्ति, कोई डिवाइन प्योरिटी ऑफ ब्लड और कास्ट का जो मिथ मेकिंग होता था, इन सब का पर्दाफाश झा साहब करते थे। कभी कभी उनके लेक्चर में कुछ डाइग्रेशन भी होता था, उसका मैं एक उदाहरण दे रहा हूँ। 1950 या 60 में बिहार रिसर्च सोसाइटी का एक बार मेन स्पीकर के रूप में डीसी सरकार आए थे और चीफ गेस्ट बिहार के गवर्नर अनंत सैनम अयंगार थे। यह सब झा साहब ने बताया। अयंगार साहब को एक आदत थी कि वो अपने एपिक का हमेशा कोट करते थे। कृष्णा सेड टू अर्जुना, अर्जुना सेड टू कृष्णा। उन्होंने पहले ही सेंटेंस में कहा, वी आर द सन्स ऑफ रामचंद्र। डीसी सरकार ने उठकर कहा, हाउ डू यू नो इट, इट इज ओनली नोन टू आवर मदर्स। हाथापाई की स्थिति आ गई। प्रोफेसर शर्मा ने रेफरी का काम किया, उनके टच में रहता था और कभी अगर भेंट न होती थी तो वो खुद फोन करते कि क्या कर रहे हो, आओ मेरे पास। 2 महीने तक हुआ, फिर बाद में बैठना लेकिन जरूर आओ। और मैं तो एक अली नाम का रिक्शा चालक था, उसका रिक्शा वो हमेशा उन्हीं के लिए रिजर्व रहता था, भेज दीजिए हम लोग को स्टेशन पहुंचा दे पहले। लेकिन वो अली उन्हीं के डिस्पोजल पर रहता था। उसके जब तक वो पटना में थे तब तक उसके पूरे परिवार का भरण पोषण वो किया करते थे। इधर जब लॉकडाउन आया तो सारे ढाबे बंद हो गए। हमारे यहाँ दरबान 2 हमेशा ड्यूटी में रहते हैं, उनको चाय कहाँ से मिले। 1-2 बार तो तरफ से मिसेज झा को हम लोगों की संवेदना उनको दे दीजिएगा।
I'm thankful to hear about their participation in various activities. It was really a wonderful, certainly the life journey of an intellectual, of an academic, of the stature of Professor Jha, of this journey that started from Presidency College but went on to Patna and then moved to Delhi. So thank you, Dr. Shukla, for these reminiscences. May I now request a student of Professor Jha. Dr. Vishwamohan Jha was also his student, but another student who submitted her MPhil and PhD under the tutelage of Professor Jha.
For which I, together with Vishwamohan Jha, also had an opportunity to provide him with certain evidences, and which he so very graciously acknowledged in the book. He effectively critiqued the commonly held belief in vegetarianism and the non-consumption. His edited tome contesting stereotypes, for which I had also contributed a chapter, he tried to present a critical analysis of everything from Ram's legend, written by different scholars, but brought together by Professor Jha, homosexuality, which was the paper where I contributed, and other religious cultural symbols such as trident, swastika, nude goddesses, figurine found in the Indian subcontinent. Professor Jha skithed yet another shibboleth with the sharpness of his finely tuned scholarship in his 2018 publication, Against the Grain, Notes on Identity, Intolerance and History. The great worth of this book lay in his painstaking evidence, which he amassed, collated, and the arguments which he forwarded empirical data. It was a historian's answer to a babble of half-baked political sloganeering and established him as the foremost public intellectual. As a personality, what struck me the most about him was how a scholar with his fierce commitment could always speak in such mellow tones. I have no memory of Jha Sahab ever raising his voice, and I knew him for over 3 decades. Among my most cherished memories of him are his calling me sometime in the late 1990s when I was in the middle of my PhD research, but at the same time bogged down with the responsibility of running a house and raising my 2-year-old son, and therefore perhaps failing to meet my research deadlines to his satisfaction. When I reached his Probin Road house, he placed John Brockington's The Sanskrit Epics in my hand, which had just been published. See how generously he has cited your Mahabharat book. Get euphoric. Understand that this raises the bar for your future research output. With hindsight, this was the most precious advice which he could have given me. And I will always, all my life till the end, be grateful to him for it. In the last 11 years since my moving into the postgraduate department at Delhi University, Jha Sahab began to use me as a sounding board. I personally always tell my family, "Meri padonnati kar di thi Jha Sahab ne." I'm sure I was just one amongst many serving this purpose in his unflagging research journey, which was nothing if not inspirational. He would discuss readings, particularly on the theme of gender, when he was revising his textbook on ancient India. However, our association was not all shop. In the middle of the pandemic last year, he phoned to inquire about mine and my family's well-being. Unfailingly courteous, he would always return a call and reply to all emails. The last chat with him was in January, when I called to wish him a Happy New Year. Little did I know that it would be my last communication with him. Thank you, dear sir, and my condolence to Mrs. Jha. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. May I now request Dr. K.K. Mandal, who's from Bhagalpur University, to say a few words. Dr. Mandal is also an EC member of the Indian History Congress. Dr. Mandal, can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you, madam. Hello. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, madam. No doubt the demise of Professor DN Jha is really a terrible loss to Marxist history writing. I have never met him. In fact, I was...
Dr. Mandal, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. The connection seems to be...
Hello. Hello.
Dr. Mandal, the connection seems to be a little weak. Can you speak again? Can you begin again? I'm sorry about this.
No doubt. Hello. Hello.
Please go ahead.
No doubt the demise of Professor DN Jha is really a terrible loss to Marxist history writing in India. He was a distinguished professor of history as well as author of many books. In fact, he was a teacher of my teacher, Professor Vijay Kumar Thakur at Patna University. This is pinching now. I read many of his books, but I love presidential address of Indian History Congress held at Voltaire in 1979, which generated the intense between Marxist and non-Marxist. Thus, he proved Marxist history writing is a dynamic evolving, and living science. He defended the Marxist construct for analyzing the nature of political economy of early medieval India. In this context, he edited two books, Feudal Formation in Early India and Feudal Order. Professor Jha broke the stagnant and ahistorical Indian society constructed by colonial historians, just as he exploded the myth of golden age by nationalist historians, thus making sharp departure from colonial and nationalist historiography. His books contesting symbols and stereotypes against the grains and trink of immortality are the best examples of this approach. Professor Jha displayed a remarkable foresight in his fight against communal politics. He authored jointly with three scholars, Ram Janmabhoomi Masjid, a historian's report to nation, focusing on historical issues involved in Ayodhya dispute. He was thus in the forefront of secular academics, combating the elements. Professor Jha's book, The Myth of Holy Cow, exposed the nature of making of myth and the way symbols are used politically to divide people. The present Hindu government is playing the same card. You are quite aware of the polemics between the followers and opponents of Indian feudalism. To mitigate this polemics, Professor Jha set a new research agenda in his book entitled Mind Over Matters. By adopting the model of history of mentalities delineated by analysis tool, a similar history of India is still wanting, I think. Such a research for a new dimension in medieval India shall be the best tribute to his memory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mandal. May I now request Professor P.K. Basant, who teaches in the Department of History at Jamia Millia Islamia, to say a few words.
Thank you, Mahalakshmi. I have known Professor Jha through his books. Since his scholarship and his courage has been discussed by so many of our colleagues here, I'll just focus on the myth of the holy cow. And I just want to quote him because I thought it conveyed some of the things that we were talking about in his own words. It's just a small extract. It says, I quote, "A few words are necessary to explain the vicissitudes the present book has had to face on account of the increasing weight of Hindu fundamentalism in India. Its original publisher suddenly discovered excessive sa-dibuf in the manuscript in the final stages of printing and recanted from his professional commitment under pressure. Shortly afterwards, I began to get threats from unidentified callers asking me not to go ahead with the publication. Undeterred by all this, Matrix Books, a new enterprising publishing house based in Delhi, mustered enough courage to publish the book promptly in the first week of August 2001. Some right-wing politicians and groups of religious fanatics, without reading a single page, termed it blasphemous, demanded my arrest and succeeded in obtaining a court order to the circulation of the book. And a self-appointed custodian of Hinduism even sentenced me to death. The book was therefore published abroad, unquote. I read it out because this story now sounds all too familiar. But what is obvious to me is that through this book, Professor Jha was trying to enter the space of public discourse. As far as historians were concerned, there was a near unanimity that beef was consumed by Brahmanical communities in the Vedic period and in the subsequent times too. Professor Jha sensed the rising tide of Hindu communalism and decided to fight it by creating a well-researched historical narrative about beef eating. In effect, Professor Jha sensed the saber rattling by the Hindutva forces and stood up to challenge them. That is courage. He knew that he was fighting a battle where the chances of winning were negligible. Yet he fought. That is courage. Friends have quoted Croce, and what strikes me about Croce's way of writing, about ways of visualizing history, is that history seems to be more about the contemporary era than about the theme that it's supposed to be writing about. Professor DN Jha's work on cows is an example of this negotiation between the past and the present. He knew that a book on beef eating meant confronting crowds that bayed for the blood of those who were suspected of promoting beef eating. He left us with a vision possibly best expressed in Tennyson's Ulysses. I quote, "Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Basan. I will now request Jaya Tyagi, who, like Professor Shalini Shah, is in the Department of University, and like Professor Vishwamohan Jha and Shalini Shah, is also a student of Professor DN Jha, who had submitted her thesis under his supervision. Professor Tyagi.
Thank you, respected colleagues, Madam Jha, and members of family. The entire academic community faces a deep void with the loss of Professor Jha, a void which will be very difficult to fill up. He was a historian par excellence, meticulous, methodical, following in the footsteps of D.D. Kasambi and Professor R.S. Sharma. It was a privilege to be taught by him. Delhi University in the 80s had historians of great eminence, amongst whom he held his own with his erudition and with his nurturing teacher, and I still cherish memories of our classes. His lectures would be immensely interesting and detailed, painstakingly prepared. We would listen carefully, hanging on to every quietly spoken word. He had this amazing clarity of thought, complex ideas with ease. He also had dry wit, which he was scared or, he always used. And in that sense, it was always a pleasure to be in his classroom. He also was worried about the contemporary sectarianism and deeply anguished with the shallow sectarian vested interests. He never hesitated to raise his voice against them, but always with wry humor and sardonic cynicism, never with acrimony or any malice. I never saw him lose his quiet equanimity, even in face of various challenges and all manner of opposition. He had an amazing repertoire and could wax eloquent about a range of things: history, poetry, literature, and of course, contemporary politics. As a historian, his contribution lies in demystifying ancient India and discouraging attempts to look at it with rose-tinted gaze. He also deviated from attempts to represent ancient India with secular credentials. He uncloaked this facade, showing how religious violence and appropriation were part of the history's times. The fact that being banal or mundane, by paying bare texts and accounts, is testimony to craftsmanship as a historian. It is his contribution to history, ability to actually retrieve and present complex ideas and practices in a manner that unravels the deeply entangled and intersecting layers of early societies that have helped open up possibilities of further research for generations of scholars like me. So I pay my tribute to him and thank you for including me in this memorial meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tyagi. May I now request Sanjay Kumar, Dr. Sanjay Kumar, who is also a product of Patna University, who studied there much after Professor Jha had left, perhaps, but who, through his teachers, had many memories that were shared of Professor Jha. So I request Dr. Sanjay Kumar, who now teaches and who's the principal of a government college in Uttarakhand, to kindly say a few words. Sanjay ji, can you just unmute yourself, please?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Good evening, all of you. Let me express my gratefulness to the combined organizers, Aligarh Historian Society, Delhi Historians Group, Sahmat and Social Scientists, for organizing memorial meeting in honor of who earned huge reputation as a professional historian, committed for scientific rational historiography, as well as an iconoclast, an assertive Marxist scholar, a dissenter, and a public intellectual, having the enough courage to face the challenges posed by the groups who were quite uncomfortable with Jha's position and stand. Every iconoclast has to pay the heavy cost of their ideological conviction, and so Professor Jha was no exception to this. At the same time, he invited severe attacks, politically motivated protests, indecent remarks, unfair criticisms from many corners, and it is unfortunate that he was termed even as a leading historian, Gumrah karne wale itihaaskar, in one Navedi. During his long academic career, he fought at two fronts. Since his young days, major ailments and physical suffering followed him like his shadow. But with a strong willpower, he never discussed it even in most depressing moments of his life. On the another fronts, he has strongly defended the attacks on the discipline of history and firmly stood by on his stand. Three institutions closely, directly, and intimately associated were Presidency College Kolkata, Patna University, and finally Delhi University, which played instrumental role in the making of Professor DN Jha. But the most profound impact on his approach, understanding, and analysis has been of Patna University, where he studied at PG level and later on did his PhD on revenue system time in 1964 under a renowned historian with two remarkable works, Early History of Vaishali and History. Quite sure that Professor Vishmohan Jha, Professor Basant, and Professor K.K. Mandal must be aware of the fact that he was not PhD student of R.S. Sharma, not at all. The student of Yogendra Mishra, tributes for almost all the words regarding DN Jha and Professor Sharma. No one met real super de facto Professor Yogendra Mishra. So this is perhaps least known fact that though Professor Jha was ideologically a disciple of legendary historian Professor R.S. Sharma, whom he first met in 1957, but on the advice of Professor R.S. Sharma, he worked with Yogendra Mishra. He was registered with Yogendra Mishra. Yesterday, I called Professor Jayashree Mishra, who is the daughter of Professor Yogendra Mishra. I asked her that whether you know that Professor DN Jha was a student of your father. She told me that whether he was a student of my father or not, I can't